Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Claas Behrends. He's a professor at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt on the Oder. He's a historian of Eastern Europe and the co-author of a German-speaking podcast, Salonkolumnisten. For those who speak German, highly recommended. Welcome to our podcast, Professor Behrends.
Hello.
You study history of Eastern Europe, of Russia, of the Soviet Union, of the countries in the Eastern Europe since several decades. And now your job seems to be, seems to reach the time when the politicians come to you for advice. Is it so?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a scientist, of course, an academic first and foremost. I teach, I write, I research about Eastern Europe, but I'm also seeing that that there's often a lack of competence, a lack of knowledge in the German public sphere, and wherever I can, I try to give my input, give my advice, and especially with regard to the Russia policy, which of course was very failed in this country for the last 2 decades. I think it's important also for academics to give their input here. But of course, I'm not in a position of power, and my influence is actually probably pretty small.
What was the reason that the German political elites ignored the history of all the countries between Germany and Russia, like Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltic countries, and focused mostly on their contacts to Moscow, ignoring Kiev, Warsaw, Tallinn, Riga, and other capitals?
Well, I think you cannot generally say that. I think in the 1990s, for example, you have a different picture under Helmut Kohl, where the German government did very much support Poland's entry into the European Union and NATO. Schröder and Merkel, of course, is an entirely different story. That's when the fixation of Moscow became bigger again. And I think there was a certain illusion that if we have good relations with the Kremlin, that this is the key to having peace in Eastern Europe, to having tranquility in Eastern Europe. And then you don't have to deal with all the complicated countries in between the Baltics and the Black Sea. But you just concentrate on Moscow. And of course, this was wrong. But it came also out of a certain, I think, academic and political tradition in Germany, where relations to Russia were always more important than the relations to other East European countries. You could trace this back, of course, all the way to Prussia or Bismarck, or, in the 19th, 18th century, the divisions of Poland and so on. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it's a historical fact, of course, that this sort of German thinking prevailed for a long time.
But when we are looking at the situation in academia, we had all the time the German, Ukrainian, for example, Historians Commission, which theoretically had to be a tool to improve understanding of what is going on in Ukraine, why Ukraine is important. But until the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia in February 2022, the Commission was not vocal. And even some recommendations by the Commission were surprising from the modern point of view. Like, for example, until 2022, the Commission recommended not to call Holodomor, the Stalin's policy of exterminating Ukrainians by hunger. The Commission recommended not to recognize it as a genocide.
Well, I mean, even the German Historical Commission with Ukraine was only founded after Maidan. We shouldn't forget that. It was only founded in 2014, 2015 as a reaction to the Maidan, Euromaidan revolution of dignity, actually. So you can see that, there was always a Russian-German Historical Commission, which dated back to the 1990s. It's even worse, actually, if you look at Belarus. There are very few experts on Belarus in this countries. So it's a larger problem, and I think it's being addressed right now in German academia with the whole discussion about decolonization of German historical and social science on Eastern Europe, which basically means nothing different than getting away from this fixation on Moscow. But on the other hand, I mean, in the middle of the war, of course, we still also urgently need more knowledge about Moscow, because although Germany was very much focused on the Kremlin, it's not exactly true that that our politics got the Kremlin right. So you know, we have to basically work on both fronts, get more knowledge about Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries, but also getting Russia right, and that's what makes the task even bigger.
That's why I don't like the German word Russlandversteher, which literally translates as those who understand Russia, because it is always applied to people who explain why Russia is right and why you need to accept the Kremlin's point of view. But that is quite opposite of understanding Russia. The real Russlandversteher, the real those who understand Russia, they were shouting all the time that Russia will attack, but they were not called Russlandversteher, they were called warmonger, or even worse. But when we talk now about the situation, do we see in Germany enough funding for well-funded and well-organized research on analyzing what is going on in Russia, how we can deal with support for Ukraine and other countries? Or is it just like Zeitenwende? There is a lot of talk, but not so much funding.
Well, I mean, it always depends on whether you think that the glass is half full or half empty, I guess. Again, a little bit of history helps us to better understand it. Of course, there was a big field of East European studies during the Cold War in West Germany. And this whole academic field was scaled down in the 1990s and 2000s, especially after 9/11, when everybody and a lot of money went into Islamic studies, terrorist studies, and all this sort of stuff. But I think it starkly began changing with the foundation of ZOIS, for example, new Institute of East European Studies in after the Maidan and the Donbass war, again in Berlin in 2015, 2016. And now we have two new centers of Ukrainian studies, which are going to be established in Regensburg and at Viadrina, where I teach this year. Of course, you can always wish for more. You know, like you could wish for more arms for Ukraine or more support for Ukraine. But you also have to acknowledge that at least we got out of this ditch that we were in during the times of Angela Merkel, when everything was scaled down and there was no help for Ukraine at all. So it all depends on, you know, how you look at it. I mean, I and others are demanding more and more support, more support for academia, but also more support for Ukraine. That's of course much more important than our privileged situation in the first place. But we also have to see where we're coming from, and quite frankly, of course, we're coming from a pretty dark place.
When we're talking about the change of the attitude and if we have managed to come from the dark place, as you called it, any institution in academia is not an exception, needs a renewal when there have been some mistakes done like in the past. And as we know, like there were, even in academia, a lot of people who defended Merkel's policy or who created some sort of fundament for Merkel's policy and before Schröder's policy. And many of these people who are still not retired yet, they're now like in charge of the new created institutions, and they are working there, and they just change their tone, their tune. That does it mean that we have reached some sort of renewal? The people who provided scientific advice for more understanding of Putin, they are now very loud in supporting Ukraine, but is this the sign of a change?
Well, I think we would have to differentiate between different fields of German public and German policy. I mean, there was just recently an article in the Journal for Security Studies where a Belgian colleague has analyzed what German specialists on Russia said between November 2021 and February 2022. And it turns out that academic experts on the whole were right. They were warning of Putin's invasion. People from the think tank world on the whole were right. They were also warning that this is a very dire situation and that Ukraine should be supported. It looks much different if you look at German secret services. You know, famously, the head of the Bundesnachrichtendienst was in Kiev when the Russians started the full-scale invasion, which I guess means that they didn't expect that. We know from the Munich Security Conference in 2022 that people were making jokes about the Americans there who thought that, in 1 week we're going to have war. And I think the fundamental problems in Germany are not so much in academia. There are, of course, also problems in academia. I already mentioned the whole discourse on decolonization and so on. But the people who really got Russia wrong were in the Foreign Office, were in the secret services, were in the Chancellery, quite frankly. These people all got it wrong, and maybe we can put a link to the article of the Belgian colleague even in the show notes, which shows clearly that there are experts in Germany who got it right. Even the majority of the external experts, but these are not the people who were in parliament. These were not the people that were in government. And that's where our problem is. I think it's much more a problem of the people who are in parliament, in power, in the economic sphere, who are very much interested of business dealings with Russia, than in the think tanks and in the academic world, where at least the majority of people, I think, had a very realistic view of the situation. We can get better. Of course, we can always improve, right?
Indeed, and we are talking to young Claas Behrends, who is a professor of history at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt on the Oder in Germany, on the border between Germany and Poland, and historian of Eastern Europe, and a co-author of a German-speaking podcast, Salonkolumnisten. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And what I wanted to ask you further, you work at a very special German university, which was created as an attempt to strengthen, if not to create new links between Germany and Poland, the border city Frankfurt on the Oder. When you are in the campus, you literally see Poland out of the window of your office. Do we have now stronger relations between Poland and Germany on the field of academia, our societies, etc.? We have seen pretty strong tensions between two countries recently.
Again, I think we need to differentiate. I mean, I have no problems on the academic field to cooperate with my Polish colleagues. As a matter of fact, I was just at lunch with a Polish colleague who works also about war crimes, Russian war crimes in Ukraine. So there's several good cooperations. It looks much different if you look at the bilateral relations between governments who were, of course, especially under Angela Merkel and the peace government in Warsaw, in very bad shape. And I think hopefully this is improving at this point. Although one must say it couldn't get much worse also than in the last couple of years. But we also have to acknowledge our differences. Of course, Poland looks in a different way at the war in Ukraine. Poland is much closer to Ukraine geographically and also culturally, linguistically. We cannot expect, Germans who live in Freiburg on the French border or so to look at this in the same way as people in Krakow or Lublin would do. So we also have to acknowledge these differences. But nevertheless, we should improve our relations. And I think that places like Viadrina actually are the places where a younger generation of students work together, study together, and overcomes also the prejudices that might be there still in the older generation. People speak both languages. People live at the border. And by the way, Frankfurt Oder and Słubice, the Polish part, is not only at this point is not only very much a German-Polish city, but it's also very much a Ukrainian city, because both Frankfurt and Słubice took a lot of refugees, and we have a large Ukrainian student population. We took academics from Ukraine at Viadrina who had to flee the country. So actually one can even speak of a little bit of a triangle between Ukrainian, Polish, and German scholars. And this can just be the beginning. Of course, we have to keep the momentum. We have to keep moving. We have to collaborate even closer. But I think, we are in a good way. And it's not easy during wartime, because Also, our Ukrainian students are, after 2 years of war, very much stressed out. We have to find new funding for the refugees who are refugees, the colleagues who are refugees here in Germany. So it's an ongoing, difficult situation, but it's also a chance to restart many things and start new projects, start new collaborations, and we hope to be successful in this.
Do we understand in Germany, like as a society, and if you talk about this difference between the political elites and academia, do the elites and does the academia understand what is happening in Russia now? I remember that in 1980s, nobody in the West believed that the Soviet Union could collapse. So there was like no understanding of internal processes. Do we have a level of understanding of internal processes in Russia now? And can the knowledge of history help here?
I think that's actually something that's quite similar to the end of the 1980s or beginning of the 1990s in that part of the German elites, at least, are afraid of a complete breakdown of Russia. In a very similar way, like they were, like American and German elites or Western elites were afraid of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The most famous example of this is George Bush, the elder, famous Chicken Kiev speech of summer 1991 in Kiev, when he told Ukrainians, you can do anything, you can become free and so on, but you can never become independent. You must stay in the Soviet Union. Of course, half a year later, Ukraine was out of the Soviet Union. And we have a similar, I think, fear in parts of the elites in Berlin and Washington, who think that if Russia loses this war, it might further disintegrate, which of course might be true. I mean, some of my Russian colleagues also believe that this imperial disintegration is the future of Russia and what's left of the Russian empire. But we can also see, I think, by looking at the 1990s, that this doesn't necessarily have to be a negative process, because if you ask someone who lives in the Baltic states, for example, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, of course, was probably the most happy day or happy event for them in their lives, so that they could, become Western countries, enjoy freedom, become part of NATO and the European Union. One can also hope for the future of Eastern Europe to be maybe not as dark after this war as some people painted.
Can the knowledge of history can help here to predict what is going on in Russia now?
Well, I think, in a long line, I like to think that that we are still in the process of the disintegration of the Russian Empire, a process that started probably in 1917, and the end of empire can go on for a very, very long time, and it can sometimes be very violent. We know this from the Russian Empire. We know that, but we also know this from the British Empire or the Roman Empire. The disintegration of these empires also took a couple of hundred years. And why should it be so different in Russia, actually? Generally, I don't believe that you can predict much with history, except for that. For example, wars like the war that we are in, wars are always like catalysts of social and political processes. The problem is sometimes the conservative thinking of our elites. Our elites would like things to stay stable, to stay predictable. They hate the uncertainty that comes with war. Nobody knows how this war is going to end, who's going to win. It also depends on us, of course, on our support of Ukraine, but still, it's a black box. Basically, if we're honest, we don't know where we're going to be. 2 years ago, we didn't think that we would be in this situation, and what will be in 2 years, we cannot know. Except for that, we know that nothing's ever going to be the same as it was before this war. Wars change everything, and the situation at the end of the war will be a completely new one, and it will be the challenge of our generation to make Ukraine win this war and to fend off the Russian threat to Europe. And if we fail in this, consequences are going to be very harsh, and we're going to be again in a much darker place than we were since the end of the Cold War.
And what is the reason that the politicians in many countries, including Germany, seem not to understand it? When we look at the statements of our Chancellor Olaf Scholz, they're sometimes pretty hawkish when he talks about that Ukraine must not lose, that we must stay with Ukraine, that Putin has started this war, and he must end this war by bringing his troops out of Ukraine. It's pretty hawkish. It's not like Olaf Scholz 3 years ago. But when we look at the deeds, we still are very reluctant in supplying Ukraine with arms, although most experts say that it is the only way to help Ukraine to create more leverage. Even if the German elites want Ukraine to end this war on a diplomatic field, Ukraine must have leverage, and arms can provide this leverage. What is the reason for that discrepancy between the words and the deeds?
Well, I mean, I think generally European elites realize or begin to realize that this war is going to be very costly. And at this point, nobody wants to tell the population the truth, that, of course, if this war keeps going on and we're going to support Ukraine much stronger, even if the Americans might drop out of the supporters of Ukraine, then, you know, we would have to have cuts in our academic or social or whatever infrastructural spending here in Germany. I mean, the whole refurnishment of our army is already costing billions and billions because we underfinanced the army for such a long time, and the whole rebuilding of the armed forces is going to be expensive. The war in Ukraine is going to be expensive, and I think many politicians would like to ignore that. I mean, they didn't necessarily become foreign policy specialists, but they joined politics. They became a member of the Bundestag because they wanted more social programs or better infrastructure or something like that. So, I mean, it's a democracy. It's an ongoing process of struggle for priorities. And all that we can do is to say that, you know, without freedom, all this infrastructure and social programs are not going to lead us anywhere. So the freedom struggle of Ukraine is more important than other things. But I agree with you, you know, not everybody has realized that. But I think, you know, this is not only a German problem. This is also very much a French problem or a Spanish problem or Italian problem. And I don't even want to mention Austria. And even if you look at the former states of the communist bloc, I think you have very good support from the Baltic states, but they're small to Ukraine. But some of the bigger post-communist states, you know, they'd like to give Ukraine at the beginning of the war their old Soviet equipment. But now that they actually have to pay for Western weapons to send them to Ukraine, I also don't see too much enthusiasm, except maybe for the Czechs, who really did a very good thing with their ammunition initiative and are really helping Ukraine here. But for example, in Poland, I don't see much enthusiasm of giving away the new Western weapons to Ukraine. You know, I mean, the old MiG-29s, you know, fair enough, and the old T-80s. But, you know, that these times are over, and Western weapons are quite expensive. And, you know, everybody has to get their act together, I think, in NATO. And I hope very much that the new initiative of the NATO Secretary General, who wants these 100 billion for Ukraine, will be successful, because that would be a start at least. But even there, I mean, if this war goes on for another 2 or 3 years, you know, these 100 billions will just going to be a start. I mean, it's going to take much more effort, and yeah, I hope that people will realize this more quickly in the future, because, you know, one of our mistakes, for example, was not to begin to order new ammunition and new weapons 2 years ago. We ordered too late. That's how this Ukrainian crisis also came into being, that we see now. So we have to plan ahead a lot more. And I mean, as a historian, I would say the short story of this war so far was, you know, the first country that mobilized in this war was Ukraine. That's how they survived the year 2022. The second country that mobilized in this war was Russia. You know, it started mobilization in the fall of 2022, when they realized that their blitzkrieg had failed. But the West, and I'm talking about the whole West, from the United States to all the NATO members and possibly even South Korea, Japan, and so on, the West has never mobilized, right? That's not just a German problem. That's a problem of the entire Western world. And the Western world needs to mobilize. I think this is what people will have to realize in order to defend Ukraine and not to lose this war against Putin, who has already mobilized. And we now see the effects of this Russian mobilization. Although Russia is a very dysfunctional state, we know that it has a lot of problems with corruption and not functioning power vertical and so on and so on and so on. But at the end of the day, it's also a state with immense resources, and we're seeing these resources are being thrown into battle right now, while we sit on our resources and we don't throw them into battle, and that's our mistake in the West, I say.
We're talking with Professor Claas Behrends. He is a professor at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt on the Oder, on the border between Germany and Poland. He's historian of Eastern Europe and a supporter of Ukraine. You have already mentioned this this historical rule, if I may say so, that wars, that the wars, they turn to be catalysts of social changes and political changes. We know that the United Nations was created after World War II, the League of the Nations after World War I, NATO and the Warsaw Bloc were the results of the World War II as well. What kind of political development in the West can we expect after this war? NATO seems to have found a new reason for its existence, and countries joined NATO, which we believed will never do it like Finland or Sweden. But is it the only consequence which we will have to face? Can we expect like other changes? Nuclear Germany, for example?
I don't think there will be a nuclear Germany, but that's a different story. I think it's important for us to realize what this war is actually about. Of course, for Ukrainians, it's primarily about their country, their freedom, their independence. But it's also about a greater good. It's about the order of Europe, right? This is what's being fought for in this war. Do we want a Europe of spheres of influence? That's what Putin wants, basically. Back to Yalta, where you had a big Russian sphere of influence that included Berlin and Warsaw and Budapest and Prague and Bucharest and all these countries. Or do we want a Europe of free nations, which is basically the NATO and EU model, where people can join NATO or EU, but they can also leave, like Britain left. And do we want the same sovereignty for everybody? Basically, I explain it to my students always in this way. Is Ukraine and should Ukraine be as sovereign as Portugal, for example, right? If Portugal tomorrow decides that they will leave NATO and EU, everybody's going to say, well, maybe that's a stupid decision, but, hey, you're a free country, Portugal. You can do whatever you want. So you leave, right? And so they leave, and maybe they will join again. But for Ukraine, Russia thinks that they have a say, a veto, sort of like about, Ukraine joining NATO or joining the EU. And which means basically that from the Russian point of view, there are sovereign nations in Europe and there are not so sovereign nations in Europe. And the not so sovereign nations,
practically the Brezhnev's doctrine of unlimited sovereignty. So
exactly. That was a nicer name for empire, right? They call it Brezhnev doctrine or so. I mean, of course, it was also already there before Brezhnev under Khrushchev or under Stalin. It basically is a system of limited sovereignty. And this is what Russia wants to impose on Ukraine, of course. But, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that they only want to impose it on Ukraine. They will go as far as they can get with this. And, they will also try to impose the system again on Kazakhstan, on the Caucasus, on Poland, maybe, on the Baltic states. Because they basically, you can see it if you read the Kremlin's documents from November 2021, when they entered negotiations with the West. If you read these documents very carefully, that you can find on the Kremlin website, you will see that the Kremlin basically wants a return to the Order of Yalta. They say that everything that changed since the 1990s must be reversed, right?
But that is exactly, I think, the most crucial question. Did they really want to come back to Yalta, or did they want to go deeper into the past? Because Yalta and all the development after that was the development of division of the world, when the Soviet Union said clearly, okay, we have this border and we don't want you to intervene behind this border. That led effectively and ultimately to the Helsinki Agreement, and which was practically setting the limits of the Soviet Empire, and the Soviet Empire was happy with that. But now, what we see from Putin, he is not happy with any limits. his hunger is unlimited. He wants to have more and more, and as much we give him, as more his hunger grows. It is quite different that we had during the Brezhnev time, isn't it?
Well, of course, Russia nowadays is a revisionist power, and back then it was a status quo power. It wanted to keep, but it had an empire. Now it doesn't have an empire, right? So that's a difference. As Brzezinski famously said, Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Russia without Ukraine is just Russia, right? And Putin also realizes that, and his hunger indeed might be unlimited. If he even talks about Alaska and all these fantasies on Russian television, but we know also that his resources are not unlimited, right? And that the West actually, in economic and military terms, is of course much stronger than Putin is. So we shouldn't also fear, too much the ambitions of Russia. One might say, in some respects, that Russia is already again in a situation of imperial overstretch. Already they have to again abandon places like Armenia, where they were very strong before they invaded Ukraine. So, you have internal mutinies like the Prigozhin mutiny. So there is actually also signs of a certain overstretch already on the Russian side. And so Russia is only as strong as we let them be, right? If we give more F-16s quicker to Ukraine, if we give more air support to Ukraine, if we are even tougher on the sanctions, I don't think that the Russian resources are unlimited. And I do think that there's a point when even the Putin system is going to crack, because it's actually a system that talks a lot about stability. But if it's such a, by now it only rests basically on very severe repressions. The repressions that we see in Russia now, that someone who just puts like a couple of peace stickers on yogurt in a supermarket goes to a lager for 8 years. That's basically Stalinism, if you ask me. Even under Brezhnev, you wouldn't have had such harsh sentences. So the repression is very, very high, and we don't know how long it's going to last. It might last another 10 years. But it might also be over tomorrow, quite frankly. We have to prepare for both, and that makes it so difficult. It could go on under Putin for quite a long time. We know it from regimes like in Cuba or North Korea. Or it could collapse very quickly, like Ukrainian regime collapsed during Maidan revolution and so on. And that's the ambivalence that we have to live with. I don't think that the Putin system is inherently very stable. I think that also in the Russian elites, there's a lot of discontent with Putin, that these people who are very rich in Russia, they don't necessarily all care about Ukraine or about Crimea that much. I think a lot of them also care about getting their villas back in Nice or in Miami Beach, having their children study in Cambridge or at Harvard and so on. And not all of these people are, I think, happy with this war. They're just very afraid because they know they're going to lose their property. Maybe they're going to lose their life. That's why they don't go into opposition. But once we see cracks in the Russian system, I'm not so sure how long it is going to last. But at this point, it lasts, and that's why it's our only chance to support Ukraine with as much as we have.
But this hope that the elites will be so much bonded to their villas in London or in Nizza that they will provide at least some hidden resistance to Putin. Like we had a lot of this hope in 2022, but after that, this hope disappeared, as we saw that maybe from the point of view of some general, yes, it is. He's unhappy that he has lost his villa, but he knows if he wins the war, he will get another villa. He will get enough money from the army from like occupied territories in Ukraine. He can build another one. But if he loses the war, everything is gone. Isn't it the case that they changed, like within the last 2 years, they have changed their mind, and now they understand that their future is in the victory and not in what one would call like betrayal of the national leader?
Well, I'm sure this is true for most of the army, or what the Russians call the siloviki, the people in the services and the secret services and the huge Russian security apparatus. I mean, if this apparatus, excuse me, if this apparatus lost the the war, it would lose its position of power, and I think these people very well understand that. I'm not so sure that this is true for the economic elites, for the people in the whole, carbohydrate business of oil and gas and timber and so on. I mean, quite frankly, I think these people don't want a villa in Kherson. They want their villa in Miami Beach, right? They know that there's a difference between Kherson and Miami Beach. They want their house in London. They don't want their apartment in Rubeljovka, right? They like the West. They've tasted the West for 3 decades, and I'm not sure they're too happy about Putin taking away this West from them. But yeah, I think it's a split within the Russian elite. One has to argue very carefully. There's the Siloviki, there's the economic elites, there's the academic elites, there's the intelligentsia, which has now partially left the country. We don't know how many of them are going to return. I mean, if you look around Berlin, quite frankly, there are a lot of them here. Not everybody supports Ukraine, but they also don't really see themselves as supporters of Putin. They understand that the life for them would be very uncomfortable under Putin, actually. So there are a lot of fissures. There are a lot of internal contradictions also within the Russian system. And so far it's held together, like always in Russia, by one person, by autocratic rule, by personal dictatorship, by repression, also by rewards, of course. People get rewarded for their war effort, or but these rewards are limited. I mean, in the 1990s or in the 2000s, these rewards were global. You could have a yacht and you could be in Jamaica yesterday and in Petersburg tomorrow, and all of this global world is gone for the Russians. And believe me, they don't want to move to Beijing. They understand very well that Miami or New York is much nicer than Beijing or Shanghai. This is all like a marriage of convenience, because they need a partner against the West, but they detest the Chinese. They're very racist. They don't like the Chinese. All of this is much weaker. I think this alliance that we see is not what Putin would make of it with unbreakable friendship. I think the smart people in Russia even understand that one of the great risks for Russia in this war is that they might become a colony of China as a result of this war, because China is much stronger economically, technologically, and so on. And it's already taking over a lot of Russian companies and firms, and buying up land in Siberia and so on. Maybe all of this is a much bigger danger for Russia, actually, than the West and NATO. But we will see how this plays out. It all depends on the outcome of the war. A very weak Russia after the war could partially also fall victim to a very aggressive China of Xi Jinping.
If we look at the situation now, and you as a historian, like a lot of examples from the past, and some like people said, even like in 22, 23, we are now in like World War II, 1943. When the Third Reich seems to be strong and can even like have enough power to start 1 or 2 effective offensive operations, but strategically it is lost. So that was like one point of view. Another point of view says that, okay, now we are just in the beginning, and Russia is not the Third Reich. Russia is more Mussolini's Italy, which starts the first aggressions like in Ethiopia and in Libya, but the real war will come when the real Third Reich, let it be China, will join the war, and then the war will really be a world war. Now we just have a local war. And the third said, no, we are now like more in Afghanistan war. When the Soviet Union started the colonial war, was shocked by how unsuccessful it is, and the US provided limited support to the Afghan resistance fighters, and the Soviet Union collapsed as a result of it. What scenario, from your perspective, is the most realistic one, or none of them?
I think, quite frankly, it would probably be a mixture of all of that, and we cannot exclude any of these scenarios at this point. I mean, first of all, my point would be this war has been going on not for 2 years, but for 10 years. It started in 2014, obviously, and this should teach us one thing, that this war can take very many different phases. It can have very different phases. The war of 2015 is very different from the war that we have now, and we have actually no idea how it's going to be in 3 years. So we have to expect, as I said, change through war, social and political change, and we have to accept that the war has a dynamic which is hard to predict. Anybody who's read Clausewitz knows that Clausewitz, famously says, it's easy to start a war, it's hard to end a war, basically. It's much harder to find a compromise in the end, and we don't know what that will look like. And at this point, as I said, all we can do is support Ukraine as much as we can, and there are still many more possibilities. We're not even near our limits of supporting Ukraine. We're not even, we haven't mobilized, obviously. The war is going to go on for a long time, and if you take the whole situation with Iran and the war going on in the Middle East, also these wars are in some ways related to each other. The war that's going on in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, October 7th, of course, was very, very bad for Ukraine because it takes resources, it takes attention away from Ukraine. Even worse for Ukraine, of course, would be China attacking Taiwan, because that would mean that America is bound in the Pacific. But which scenario, we really don't know. But the war has been going on for 10 years. It might be a 30-year war, for all that we know.
Indeed. Could we mobilize if we wanted in Germany, with 16% of the population ready to fight, even in case when Germany is being attacked?
I'm not sure I believe these numbers. I think, of course, Germans pretty much also tell what or do what authorities tell them to do. If we were told to mobilize, I think our bigger problem would be that demographically we're a pretty old society. We don't necessarily have that many young people at all, and they don't necessarily want to join the army. But our economic potential, of course, is there. We would just have to use it. The same is true, of course, for other very prosperous and rich nations like the French, the Dutch, the Danish, the Italians. All of these could mobilize much more than they have done so far.
And we hope that that will not be the case, but to prevent it, we need to invest a lot of money and technology and political will into Ukrainian victory now. Otherwise, do we want it or don't we want it? We will forced to act, and maybe the possible scenarios of our actions, none of them will be one which would be comfortable for us. It was an interview with young Claas Behrends, who is a professor at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt on the Oder. He is a historian of Eastern Europe and a co-author of a German-speaking podcast, Salonkolumnisten. Thank you, Professor Behrends, for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and wait for the next interviews.